began with a tray. Not a gunshot, not a scream. Just a tray shaking slightly in the unsteady hands of a flight attendant who had already decided who mattered and who didn't. Seat 3A sat beneath the overhead glow, dim and deliberate. In it was a black woman wearing soft cotton, not silk, braids neatly pinned, no designer logo in sight, just a quiet poise that unsettled those used to power arriving in blue eyes and pressed suits. She looked unusual for business class. That's how Becky phrased it later in the crew's Slack chat. 3A looks economy, probably a free upgrade. LOL. But what Becky didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman in 3A was undercover. She wasn't upgraded, she owned the plane. Or at least, she was hours away from doing so. And this cold sandwich they handed her. This tray missing the wine, the steak, the acknowledgement. It was the spark. The last spark before a silent detonation no one saw coming. Have you ever been handed less than what you paid for? Less than what you deserved? Less than what was given freely to the person beside you, simply because you didn't look the part? This story is for you. If you've ever swallowed the insult to keep the peace, ever stared at the ceiling instead of the server's eyes, ever told yourself it's fine, don't make a scene, then hear this. Power doesn't need to shout. It only needs to act at the right time, with the right silence. If this resonates, hit like, share, and subscribe. Because what happens next will expose more than just a flight crew. It will unveil a whole racist system dressed in champagne and customer service smiles. And now, let's return to the beginning. To the woman in seat 3A. To the subtle shrug that tried to erase her. To the gaze that skipped over her, assuming she didn't belong. She didn't push back, not yet. But as her fingers gently tapped the watch on her wrist, a quiet storm was already being uploaded. There was something almost deliberate about the way they skipped her. Not rushed, not flustered, just intentional. The flight attendant moved through the aisle of the business class cabin like she had done it 100 times. Maybe she had champagne here, Wagyu there. She smiled with that performative crispness that made every word sound like it had been ironed before delivery. But when she reached seat 3A, her hands hesitated, for less than half a breath. Then she smiled past the woman sitting there, past the calm face and the low bun, past the brown skin framed by ivory headphones, and leaned instead toward the white man in 3B. Sir, would you like the Chateau Margaux or the Burgundy Reserve with your steak? Her tray never tilted toward 3A. The woman didn't flinch, didn't raise her hand. She simply blinked once, slowly, and turned her gaze toward the window, as if the clouds outside might offer better company than the curated hospitality she'd paid for. She was dressed simply soft gray trousers, a navy sweater, no jewelry save for a thin gold bracelet on her right wrist, but her presence had weight, a stillness that was not born of passivity, but calculation. She was watching, measuring, absorbing. No one asked her what wine she preferred. No one addressed her by name. And when the food came, they handed her a tray with a cold sandwich and a cup of water. No cloth napkin, no silverware, no apology. Seat 3A, they assumed, was a mistake. But the real mistake was thinking she wouldn't notice. The man in 3B mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, Mont Blanc pen clipped to his shirt pocket gave her a sideways glance, the kind that asked a question without wanting an answer. You got bumped up, he asked casually, before biting into his seared filet mignon. She turned her head slightly, met his gaze with no smile, no nod, no reply, just presence. Then she returned to the view beyond the clouds. He cleared his throat and looked away first. A few rows ahead, laughter rippled through the cabin as glasses clinked. A tall blonde attendant leaned over seat 1C, offering dessert options with the warmth of practiced familiarity. The woman in 3A counted them. 4 white men in bespoke suits, each greeted by name. Each served before the seatbelt sign turned off. Each offered refills without request. Her tray, meanwhile, sat untouched. Not out of protest, but because she needed to memorize this every gesture, every omission. The cold sandwich had become a symbol now, wrapped in cellophane, served on a plastic plate, accompanied by the kind of water cup you'd expect in economy. She shifted slightly, letting the bracelet on her wrist slide down just enough to reveal the watch beneath. It lit up softly. Recording started. No one noticed. No one ever does. She wasn't dressed like the headlines. She didn't move like disruption. But she was exactly what this cabin had never planned for. A black woman who didn't beg to be seen but had come prepared for what would be exposed. She tapped the side of her smartwatch twice, not hard, not fast, just enough. A faint vibration signaled connection, a system humming silently into motion, thousands of feet above the Atlantic. On the screen, audit mode initiated, cabin timestamp 1342. From a distant office in Lower Manhattan, data threads began to pulse. Facial recognition, voice modulation, service interaction logs. Not just from this flight, but from the last 7 flights of this particular crew. Her name wasn't Celeste, not this time. Her ticket read, Nia Grant, a name borrowed from her mother's maiden line. No press release, just a presence in the dark, the kind that systems underestimate. This wasn't a business trip, it was a test. She had warned the board, you don't fix a culture from the top. You audit it from the ground up, or in this case, from the aisle up. And what she found was worse than numbers could show. She took a long, unhurried breath and looked around. Becky, the blonde attendant, was still laughing softly near seat 2C. Her smile was tilted too perfectly. Her eyes never once glanced back at 3A. It wasn't malice. That would have been easier to confront. It was indifference. The kind that decides who deserves warmth and who gets water. And yet, Nia said nothing. Because sometimes saying nothing is not surrender. It's the sharpening of the blade. Back in New York, 6 hours behind the clouds, a server blinked to life. Not the public server. Not the one with meal logs or passenger surveys. This one sat beneath layers of encryption housed inside the equity systems lab of a private holding firm that few had ever heard of. Yet most airlines unknowingly relied on for predictive behavioral analytics. At its helm sat Amara Ling, 32 systems engineer and data ethicist. Her dark eyes scanned the incoming request from NIAG. Priority code, expose 917. She didn't pause, she didn't question. She knew what that code meant. The screen filled with real-time audio feeds, mapped interactions, AI-generated sentiment trees, color-coded, indexed, by race, by tone, by response time. The cabin crew's names glowed on the left side: Becky Whitmore, Daniel Clean, Marissa Tate. Amara adjusted her headphones. She played the segment time-stamped 13:43:12 just after the sandwich tray was delivered. Guess they're letting economy folks test out the good seats today? Becky's voice floated in, followed by a chuckle and the clink of a wine glass. Next, from Daniel, barely audible but caught by Mike. Just don't waste the Chardonnay on them. Amara froze, not because it surprised her, but because she had heard versions of this before. Soft racism, institutionalized, dressed in customer service uniforms. She highlighted the clip, tagged it pattern match-coded racial bias, passive exclusion model. Back on the plane, Nia Grant, the woman in 3A, blinked twice at her watch. Confirmation received. Her silence was not passive, it was networked. She had once spoken up. It was 8 years ago, in the headquarters of a prestigious hedge fund in Midtown Manhattan. Nia Grant, fresh from MIT, founder of a data-compliance startup barely out of beta, stood in a glass-walled boardroom full of men who mistook her for the intern. One of them had leaned back, chuckled, and said, "You're surprisingly articulate for someone in your demographic." She had laughed politely, then corrected every item on his slide deck from risk thresholds to predicted fraud triggers in 5 minutes flat. The room had gone quiet. And yet, the next morning, the firm invested in a rival startup founded by 2 white dropouts from Cornell. That night, Nia stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and whispered, "It's not about being loud. It's about being unavoidable." That was the moment the idea began. If she couldn't change minds, she would build a system that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be silenced, and didn't flinch under power because it would be the power, rooted in code, fed by pattern, driven by truth. The invisible protocol was born 6 months later. It didn't need investors. It needed data and the patience of someone who had learned to walk through every insult and turn it into infrastructure. Now, at 38, sitting silently in seat 3A with a cold sandwich on her tray and a fully activated surveillance AI in her wrist, she wasn't just a passenger. She was a reckoning. In the flickering glow of 3 parallel screens, Amara Ling's fingers danced across the keyboard, her breath shallow, her mind in protocol mode. She wasn't just scanning for rudeness. She was mapping behavior. Becky Whitmore's service pattern showed up like a shadow on a bone scan. Response time 34 seconds to white male passengers, average. Response time to black or brown women, 3 minutes 16 seconds, median. Meal substitution occurrences, 6 incidents in 12 months, all involving non-white passengers. Apology rate 0. Daniel Klein's log wasn't better. He had never greeted a woman of color by name, though airline policy required name recognition in business class. One tag caught Amara's eye. Flight 604 August. A Nigerian venture capitalist pre-ordered halal lamb, served bacon pasta, twice, complained, no resolution. She played the archived audio. She was probably fasting anyway. Saved us a tray, Becky whispered. Daniel laughed. Amara's jaw clenched. Her hand hovered above the keyboard, then dropped. Send packet. At 38,000 feet above, Nia Grant's smartwatch vibrated once. Packet received. Confirmed delivery to internal code red flag, equity partners oversight. She didn't smile, she didn't blink. But somewhere in her spine, a quiet switch flipped. This wasn't just a cultural flaw, it was a business risk, and Nia was not only the test subject, she was the shadow shareholder. And she had just activated the clause that could launch a full executive review of Flight Crew 927 starting the moment wheels touched ground. The sandwich on her tray hadn't moved, but the system beneath her had. A light flickered above row 2. No one noticed. Business class remained immersed in clinking cutlery and crisp linen, perfumed with Chateau Margaux and entitlement. But in seat 3A, Nia Grant pressed her index finger to the underside of her leather watch band, a strip few people knew existed. 3 taps, 1 pause, 1 swipe. The screen dimmed. Secure line encrypted. Destination board proxy. Directive 917G. Message trigger clause. Audit review. This flight. It was the kind of message that didn't ask permission. Minutes later, in a quiet floor of a glass-paneled building in Zurich, an older man, Leopold Marceau, board proxy for Javari Equity Holdings, opened the blinking alert with a raised eyebrow. He read the ID attached. He blinked once. Nia Grant, Class A voting rights, silent partner. His assistant leaned in. Shall I inform the airline? He shook his head. Not yet. Let's see what else she gathers. Ms. Grant never moves without full checkmate. Back on the plane, the crew still smiled oblivious. Daniel poured more wine for the row ahead. Becky leaned down again, pressing her hand just slightly onto a passenger's forearm. Not once did they look at 3A. Which was the point? Because invisibility was no longer their protection. It was her advantage. And Nia, silently observing through half-lowered lashes, was now documenting their collapse frame by frame, second by second. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had just raised the stakes. Becky Whitmore felt it before she saw it. A ripple, a shift in temperature, not the air of the room. She had been moving down the aisle for the last 30 minutes, smiling, pouring, checking boxes invisible to most. But now, as she reached seat 2B, her laughter fell into a strange, hollow quiet. The man in 2B, a hedge fund manager from Boston she'd served 3 times before, didn't meet her eye this time. He nodded curtly, didn't ask for a refill, didn't call her darling the way he usually did. Strange. 2 rows back, the woman in 3A still sat with perfect stillness, same posture, same half-curled fingers on her lap, Same untouched sandwich tray. But there was something else now. A presence that didn't belong to the outfit she wore. No logos, no badge of wealth, but something more calibrated. Becky glanced at her. For the first time, really looked. The woman's eyes met hers. Calm, steady, not angry, not confused, just watching. Becky forced a smile. Can I get you anything else? Nia tilted her head just slightly. No, thank you, she said, voice low and crisp. It wasn't the words. It was the weight behind them. The way silence had been sharpened into a scalpel. Becky moved on, unsettled, her rhythm now off, her smile fading between steps. She didn't know it yet, but the service hierarchy she had depended on for years, who got smiles, who got scraps, was no longer in her hands. It was now in the hands of the woman she had dismissed. Her watch vibrated once and then again. No sound, just pulses like a heartbeat she had trained herself to follow. Nia tapped the screen gently. A file appeared. Final report uploaded. Cross-flight pattern confirmed. Behavioral index critical bias. Crew members flagged 3. Recommended immediate action. She read every line. Every minute of extra wait time for passengers with dark skin. Every accidental substitution. Every smile delivered to one side of the aisle. Every silence dropped like a curtain. This wasn't just bad service. It was orchestrated omission. She exhaled through her nose, folded the screen closed, then reached slowly into the leather side pocket of her carry-on. Inside was a slim black case, unmarked, lightweight. She opened it, revealing a secure satellite tab, custom-built, encrypted, connected only to a closed loop accessible by 3 people globally. She typed just one line. Initiate Phase 1 review, trigger Flight Crew 927, timestamp 15:07 GMT, notify Stratus Legal Liaison, Geneva, confidential. Send. A quiet click confirmed transmission. Outside her window, clouds drifted in layers. Light pierced through, casting golden streaks over the wing. Inside the cabin, nothing seemed different. Becky smiled. Daniel poured. The man in 3B scrolled through markets. The illusion of calm held for now. But in a server farm beneath Lake Geneva, a flag had gone up. An alert marked high-risk personnel behavior. 3 crew IDs. 1 cabin. 1 flight. 1 passenger who was no longer a guest but an embedded force of reckoning. Nia closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to wait. Because now, the system was watching them back. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into JFK International. Please ensure your seatbacks and tray tables. The captain's voice trailed off into static. In the cabin, seatbelts clicked. Eyes flicked toward windows. Coffee cups were downed in hurried sips. But for seat 3A, there was no motion, no reaction. Nia Grant stayed still. Her body was calm, but her systems were in motion. Beneath the silence of her posture, 12 microtransmissions had already crossed 6 firewalls. 3 legal teams had been pinged. And 1 executive director of Stratus International Legal Division, Geneva branch, had received a file he would read 3 times, slowly, before standing up without a word. It was titled simply Passenger Experience Audit, Flight 927 Confidential, initiated by Class A authority. Downstairs at JFK, in a quiet executive lounge near Gate 46, 2 black cars had already pulled up behind the airport's secured access point. A third vehicle, unmarked, tinted, arrived precisely at 4:02 p.m. Inside sat Vivian Price, special counsel to the Stratus Global Ethics Board. She didn't carry a briefcase, just a slim tablet, and a look that said she already knew how this ended. Status, she asked without turning her head. Her assistant, a tall man with a nervous energy, handed her a phone. We have confirmation flag initiated at 15:07 GMT. Passenger in 3A is not just authorized, she's the author. Vivian smiled, a small, surgical expression. Good. Let the cabin crew disembark normally, then call them in. No drama, just precision. Back in the sky, turbulence bumped the wings gently, but not enough to matter. Becky Whitmore walked down the aisle one last time, brushing past 3A without eye contact. still holding on to the idea that this had been just another flight, just another forgettable face in an expensive seat. But as she reached the front galley, her name flashed silently on the internal manifest screen. Whitmore, Rebecca, hold for review. She didn't see it, not yet. But gravity was already at work. And this landing would be her last one on autopilot. Becky felt it in the way Daniel stopped joking. He had always been the buffer, half smile, half shrug, full confidence that whatever happened in flight stayed airborne. But now, as they neared landing, he glanced at her and said nothing. Not a word, just a nod that didn't reach his eyes. She brushed it off, until the purser handed her the passenger manifest to sign and her own name was boxed in red. A small thing. Probably nothing. She chuckled nervously. System glitch. The purser didn't laugh. As they began their landing checklist, Becky caught something else, a shift in tone. The captain's final announcement was more formal than usual. Clipped. Careful. She looked down the cabin. Most passengers were packing up. Seat 2B stretched his legs. 1C checked his Rolex. But Seat 3A. Still. Not asleep. Not tired. Just waiting like someone who had already arrived. Becky tried not to stare, but she couldn't look away. The woman was unreadable. Not cold. Not angry. But anchored. There was something in the way she fastened her seatbelt, not out of habit, but intent. Every gesture exact. No wasted energy. Becky's hand trembled slightly as she tucked a napkin into a tray slot. She didn't know why. Nothing had happened. And yet, everything suddenly felt too quiet. The landing gear screeched softly against the tarmac, a sound that usually faded into background noise. But this time, for Becky Whitmore, it felt loud. Too loud. The cabin jolted forward, then slowed into silence. Nia Grant opened her eyes. One breath in, one pause, no glance back. Seat 3A remained poised as the rest of the cabin began to stir. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. The seatbelt signs blinked off. Bags were unlatched. Suits smoothed themselves. Complaints resumed about traffic, stocks, meetings. Becky stood by the galley, tightening her bun for no reason. Her hands moved from habit, cleaning up, smiling faintly, nodding mechanically. But something was off. The lead attendant didn't initiate debrief. The cabin door didn't open right away. Becky peeked around the corner. Confused. Outside, instead of the usual ground crew in neon vests, she saw 3 individuals in tailored suits, no name tags, no tools, just tablets. Standing. Waiting. She checked the time. Too early for a gate transfer. She turned toward Daniel. Did they say VIP on this flight? Daniel didn't answer. He was looking at Seat 3A. Nia stood, slow and exact, brushing a crease from her sweater. She reached up to retrieve her carry-on, no rush, no wasted motion. She stepped into the aisle, and as she passed Becky, eyes steady, posture unshaken, she said nothing. But the weight in that silence was enough to make Becky step back. Because now, for the first time in her long career, she wasn't sure if she had just served a passenger, or awakened something far more dangerous. The cabin doors opened. Not to the usual chorus of thank you for flying with us, nor the perfunctory goodbyes from passengers too distracted to make eye contact. This time, silence walked off first. Nia Grant stepped into the jet bridge like someone returning to a place she'd already prepared, not arriving. A man in a dark suit nodded at her, murmured something inaudible. She didn't break stride. The tablet in his hand glowed briefly as her presence was logged. She was already checked in, not as a passenger, as a name behind the protocol. Behind her, Becky reached for her luggage. Her mouth opened to call out a perfunctory, "Goodbye, ma'am," but the words never made it past her lips. Because before she could speak, a voice behind her said, "Flight 927 crew, please remain on board. You're requested in room 6. It wasn't a request. Daniel froze mid-turn. The purser's smile dropped. Even the junior attendant, Marissa, looked around, waiting for someone else to take the lead. No one moved. Then Becky spoke, too quickly. Is this about the catering delay? We've had that before. Right. We just log it. The suited man at the door didn't flinch. No. Miss Whitmore, this is not about catering. Please bring your crew badges and service notes. Badges. Service notes. Becky felt the first chill run down her spine. Something had shifted. This was no longer a routine landing. This was a summons. And the woman who triggered it had already vanished into the terminal, as if she'd never been there at all. Room 6 wasn't large, it wasn't loud, but it was watching. Becky stepped in first. Daniel followed. Marissa last, clutching a notepad she hadn't written on since boarding. The lighting was soft, clinical, the kind designed to calm or to expose. 3 people sat at the table. Vivian Price, Deputy General Counsel, Stratus Global Ethics Division, hair pulled tight, face unreadable. To her left, a silent man in a gray suit, eyes fixed on a tablet. To her right, a young analyst no older than 28 whose fingers hovered over a keyboard like they were listening. Becky smiled politely. Is this a service debrief? I know 3A didn't get her original order. But Vivian raised a finger, not to silence her, to pause the performance. Before we begin, she said, her voice steady, please note this meeting is recorded under Article 9.4 of Stratus International Protocol Review for potential bias and service discrimination. Daniel blinked. Becky's smile stiffened. Sorry, what? The analyst tapped a key. A screen on the wall lit up. Footage appeared. Timestamp 1343, audio crystal clear. She looks economy. Probably bumped up. Becky's own voice, her own laugh, Daniel's chuckle in response. It played once, then silence. Vivian leaned forward, eyes still neutral. We're not here to speculate. We're here to review patterns. The analyst clicked again. Charts emerged colored, labeled. Response times, meal substitutions, eye contact frequency by race and gender. Daniel whispered, What is this? Vivian answered, This is everything you thought no one was tracking. Becky leaned forward, blinking rapidly. The screen didn't flinch. Bias Interaction Index 82.7%. Target demographic most affected black female passengers. Most frequent behavior delayed service. Verbal minimization. Reduced name acknowledgement. A heat crawled up her neck. This is taken out of context. Vivian didn't move. Which part? Becky pointed weakly toward the audio. I mean, we joke. All crews do. We blow off steam. Vivian tilted her head. By assuming passengers of color don't belong in premium seating. Becky hesitated. No, I mean it's not personal. She wasn't even dressed like a business-class passenger. Silence. That one sentence sat heavy in the room, heavier than anything before it. The analyst clicked again. Visual log 3A. Response time from crew 6 minutes 12 seconds. Nearby passenger seat 3B 41 seconds. Name used, never. Becky looked at Daniel for help. But Daniel now looked down, his fingers interlocked, jaw tight. He knew better than to speak. Vivian finally leaned back. We're not looking for apologies. We're looking for acknowledgement not just of what was said, but what was built. This pattern didn't happen by accident. Becky's voice dropped to a whisper. I've never been called racist. Vivian replied, calm and even. That's because systems like this don't need slurs. They just need shrugs like yours, enough of them to operate efficiently. And in that moment, Becky realized something more terrifying than being caught. She had never thought she'd be noticed at all. 24 floors above the terminal, in a glass conference room overlooking the runways. 6 people waited. All wore suits, all held silence like armor. At the head of the table, Elliot Branson, Regional Vice President of Stratus Air, tapped a pen once every 8 seconds. He had just received the Internal Alert Passenger-Initiated Protocol Class A Shareholder Audit, Flight 927. Beside him, legal counsel skimmed the PDF again, lips pursed. Across the table, A name glowed on the large display. Grant. NIAE. Classification, Class A. Voting partner. Affiliation, Javari Equity Holdings. Silent stake, 11.7%. And below it, one line in bold. Authorized to trigger immediate ethics board intervention. At precisely 5:06 p.m., the door opened. Nia Grant stepped in, no entourage, no folder, no apology. Her presence entered first, followed by quiet. She sat without introduction, placed a single slim device on the table, and looked at no one. Elliot tried to steady his voice. Ms. Grant, we weren't aware. She raised a hand, not dismissive, but surgical. You were aware. You just didn't think people like me would use the system we helped build. She tapped her device once. Behind her, the screen changed. Video stills, voice logs, service heat maps, passenger patterns, all color-coded by race and gender. No drama, no narration. The data spoke, and the data was deafening. She leaned back. I don't need an apology. I need systemic correction signed, enacted, and irreversible. Elliot Branson cleared his throat. We recognize this may represent a singular breach of protocol, perhaps mishandled at the crew level. Nia didn't blink. She didn't move. The screen behind her shifted again. Now, 12 flagged incidents across 5 flights. 8 repeat complaints from passengers of color. 0 disciplinary actions. A trend line read, sharp, upward. The room stilled. Singular, she asked quietly. Her voice was calm, but the weight behind it pressed into the glass. The legal counsel leaned forward, visibly unsettled. These look like anomalies. Could they be noise in the data? Nia tapped her device once more. Audio played, low quality, but clear. Just don't waste the Chardonnay on them. Pause. Another clip. She doesn't look like our usuals. Then, a final one. Becky's voice, unmistakable. Probably bumped up. No one in the room spoke. Not because they were afraid of Nia, but because the system they trusted had betrayed itself and now sat fully visible on a 52-inch screen, color-coded and time-stamped. Nia leaned forward, fingers interlaced. This isn't about discomfort. It's about math. And if your model can't serve premium service without excluding people who look like me, then your model is broken. Silence again. This time, it wasn't passive. It was the sound of an institution realizing it was out of excuses. Nia reached into her blazer, not to pull out a document, but a black lacquer pen. Unmarked. Waited. She set it gently on the table, then slid forward a single sheet of paper. It was unsigned, yet undeniable. Memo of Intent Subject Structural Reform. Mandate Class A Directive Conditions. Immediate ethics investigation into Flight 927 crew, led by independent third party. Mandatory unconscious bias retraining for all first-class staff. Reorganization of VIP service algorithm to remove implicit ranking by race, attire, or perceived status. Appointment of external advisor to lead cultural reform selected by the Class A shareholder. Elliot scanned the document, lips pressed thin. This level of intervention isn't standard. Nia's gaze didn't move. Neither is your failure. Legal counsel whispered, the optics if this goes public. Nia replied, level and low. It won't, unless you give me a reason. Pause. You have 72 hours. Or I pull the equity line tied to your Asia expansion and release this report to every press outlet I partner with. The room inhaled. Then the man in gray, silent until now, finally spoke. Who would you appoint as external advisor? Nia held the silence for a beat, then simply said, someone who knows what it's like to be handed a cold sandwich, and decide to rewrite the menu. Outside, a plane took off. Inside, a company began to land in a reality it had long avoided. Room 6 had changed. The lights were no longer soft, the air no longer still. Becky Whitmore sat with her hands clasped too tightly on the table. Daniel looked paler than the fluorescent lights overhead, Marissa had stopped speaking entirely, her notepad closed, her eyes darting between every breath. On the far end of the room, a monitor blinked. A single word flashed: review. Initiated. Vivian Price stepped in, followed by 2 legal observers from the ethics division. No greetings, no platitudes. Just procedure. Thank you for returning, Vivian began. This session is part of a formal response process under Clause 12B of the Corporate Service Ethics Act. She placed 3 sealed folders on the table. Each bore a name. Contained inside are behavioral analytics from your past 18 months of in-flight service, complaints, audio logs, time-stamped response discrepancies, video interaction records including facial prioritization captured by cabin cams. Becky's throat tightened. We were never told there were cameras tied to sentiment metrics. Vivian met her eyes. You were never told because ethical staff don't trigger those thresholds. Silence. Then Daniel spoke, barely audible. What happens now? Vivian opened a final folder. Inside 3 notices. Official. Irreversible. Effective immediately. You are placed under temporary suspension pending full disciplinary review. You will not return to in-flight duty. All digital accounts will be locked within the hour. Becky's voice cracked. Because of one tray. Vivian looked at her not cruelly, not kindly, just clearly. No. Because of the pattern behind every tray you never thought we were watching. 27 minutes after the crew received their suspension notices, the first notification hit the inboxes of Stratus board members across 3 continents. Subject: red flag review triggered Flight 927 complainant Nia E. Grant attached full audit packet plus legal impact forecast. By 6:45 p.m., 3 major investment firms had requested clarification. By 7:03, a preliminary risk memo was circulated internally. Potential exposure: implicit bias in premium tier service structures. Risk of reputational damage escalated due to silent stakeholder status of complainant. And by 7:18, the inevitable happened. A leak. Not of the full video. Not yet. But of one quote already circulating on industry Slack threads and internal forums. She doesn't look like our usuals. That line, stripped of defense, removed from context, freed from the cushion of casual, hit the bloodstream of luxury hospitality like a shot of ice. One consultant forwarded it to 5 major hotel chains, another to a concierge firm. One executive whispered, if she goes public, we're next. Because the problem was no longer Becky. It was the architecture. And Nia Grant, she wasn't asking to be heard. She was dismantling the walls between who gets seen and who gets served. The boardroom was filled, but no one spoke. Elliot Branson stood at the head of the table, hands braced against cool wood. Behind him, the screen glowed with an unspoken truth. Passenger-initiated ethics trigger. Verified stakeholder Class A. Voting partner risk level. Tier 1, structural bias. To his right, CFO Martina DuPont scrolled through a cascading thread of flagged investor responses. To his left, VP of Communications stared at a muted Bloomberg segment, silent passenger, loud reckoning. The pressure was no longer abstract, it was quantified. If we act now, Martina said quietly, we contain it internally. The equity line holds. Grant stays quiet. And if we don't, someone asked. The screen answered. A projected simulation, loss of Class A investments. Public leak triggers industry-wide reform demands. Stock price drop 17% forecasted within 2 weeks. Elliot exhaled, closed his eyes. Then opened the folder in front of him, the one Nia had left without demand, without threat. Inside a simple title. Proposed Cultural Reform Initiative, Lead Advisor Nia E. Grant. The room waited. And Elliot, the man who once described diversity as a PR bullet point, finally nodded. We bring her in. The decision wasn't dramatic. It wasn't met with applause. But it was the sound of a wall cracking. And through that crack, something new was already forming. 2 weeks later, Flight 2301 sat gleaming under the morning sun at Gate 14. Same airline, same service class, same air of quiet prestige. But something had changed. A new crew stood at attention, faces alert, eyes trained not in fear, but focus. The pre-flight cultural advisor had arrived 10 minutes prior. No security detail, no PR team, just a woman in navy slacks, a charcoal blouse, and a bracelet that now everyone noticed. Nia Grant walked the aisle silently, observing. One attendant moved to speak, then paused. She wasn't sure if she should say ma'am or Ms. Grant or simply, listen. Nia didn't stop. She walked past rows of plush seats until she reached 3A. There, neatly placed on the headrest, was a small black card, elegant, embossed, reserved for who you overlook. She didn't sit. Instead, she turned, faced the full crew, and finally spoke. You don't need to remember every name. You just need to remember every presence. Not who looks wealthy, not who belongs, just who's there. No speech, no instruction manual. Just that. Behind her, a junior attendant quietly replaced a bottle of red wine this time, without being asked at seat 2C, where a black woman in a cobalt wrap dress was settling in, unnoticed by most. Except now, the system was watching differently, because it had been redesigned by the woman it once failed to serve. They called it the 3A protocol at first, half-jokingly, inside industry group chats. But within weeks, it was formalized. Training departments across 6 airlines adopted the framework, not because of pressure, but because of proof. Passenger feedback rose. Complaints about racial service disparity dropped by 43% within the first month. Staff turnover in premium cabins decreased. And most telling of all, an open letter from former passengers of color went viral. We didn't ask for special treatment. We asked not to be filtered through someone else's expectations of who deserves linen over plastic. Nia never gave a public speech, but her name began appearing in new places in a footnote of a hospitality reform bill, in a Forbes piece titled The Silent Architect of Equity, in the rewritten training module titled Presence Awareness Beyond Demographics. Meanwhile, a subtle campaign launched by Stratus Air began appearing in lounges and airport terminals. A single image, a woman's hands, resting lightly on a closed sandwich tray. No face. Just stillness. Above it, the words. Sometimes power speaks loudest, when it doesn't speak at all. Seat 3A. It wasn't branded. It wasn't even tagged as marketing. But passengers noticed. And slowly, the industry realized luxury could no longer be measured only in thread count and vintage years. It had to include acknowledgement. And acknowledgement now had a name: Nia Grant. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, inside a sunlit office that overlooked the Hudson, Nia Grant sat at her desk, not in front of a boardroom, not at 30,000 feet, but at home. Before her crisp paper, a fountain pen, and a letter that hadn't yet been written, but had waited years to exist. She began simply, Dear Khalees, your email found me. Khalees James, 17 high school junior from Baton Rouge. She had written to Nia after hearing about that flight story through a cousin who worked ground staff. She wrote not to ask for help, but to ask if Nia had ever felt invisible too. You asked if I'd ever been skipped, overlooked, ignored. Yes, I have. But I stopped treating that as a wound, and started treating it as a mirror to show me what kind of world I'm here to redesign. Nia paused, looked out the window. A jet traced the sky, leaving no sound behind. She continued, You don't need a louder voice. You need a steadier hand. You don't need to fit the seat. You need to remember the seat was made by people, and people can change. She signed it simply. Nia. P. S. One day, they'll hand you a plastic tray and expect you to be grateful. You don't have to make a scene. Just remember who you are and start rewriting. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.